Hey everybody, this is Justin of Python for Biomedical Engineers. The idea of this video is to show you how to go from having a single Python script to writing your function or your objective or your task into a class or object-oriented programming. Now, why do you need this? Oftentimes, biomedical engineers have to write Python code as part of their work, coursework, maybe doing signal processing work, maybe doing some medical imaging work. And when you write a single Python script, initially it would be very small, but it gets ugly extremely fast, right? Maybe you have 100 lines, 200 lines of code, it becomes ugly and it becomes really difficult to manage. So in this video, we'll be looking into how do we go from having a single Python script, converting that into functions, moving that as modules, and writing it as a class, and we'll do some printing modification just so it looks much better. And what we'll be building is a finance tracker sort of application. As as it, sound, it sounds fancy, but we'll be doing something very simple just to get the idea. So I'll be starting with a I'll be starting from an empty terminal, and I have a folder here called Python for Biomedical Engineers. You can start a terminal in your VS Code, and let me just open Tmux. Now you can open a terminal in and VS Code. What we'll be doing is creating a directory called step one, so that we just keep each of our code in separate directories. And I'll create an app.py file where we'll write our code. Let me just start step one, and there we go. So what are we building? We need a single script that accepts user input. So let me just note that down. I'm going to accept user input, float user input, float amount, float number. Let's say float number. Float is basically numbers with decimal places, and un- okay, and until user enters done, we will until user enters done. Like that's sort of our application, and we need to print the net amount. Need to print the net amount if it's net positive or negative, right? This feels like a very simple exercise, and let's just write the code for that, right? So I'm going to say, let's just put in a header. I'm going to say finance tracker, and we need to accept user input, and we need to store the amount, right? So we need a variable for that. So I'm going to say amount equals initially 0, and we need to keep on accepting users. So I'm going to say while true, and let's say we'll accept the user input. So I'm going to say user input equals input enter amount. Cool. And we'll say if the user input equal to done, I'm going to say break. Otherwise, we'll say amount equals float of amount plus, no, figures a float of user input. My bad. Amount. So we just add the current amount to the current user input, and we will just print that. So I'm going to say print net amount. What's the net amount? The net amount would be the amount. And let's just say if it's negative or positive, right? So I'm going to say if amount is greater than 0, I'm going to say print amount is positive, else I'm going to say print amount is negative. Cool. And if I were to run this Python 3 app.py, it asks us the amount. Let's say 100. We'll say minus 25. Let's say minus 25 again, and say done. It just prints the net amount and say amount is positive. It works. But there are a couple of problems with these. Like, let's try and find that. So I'm sorry there. I'll say Python 3 app.py. And if I were to say some random text, it just fails, right? So basically, there's no checks we're expecting the user to input the correct value, but we kind of need this. Like, so for example, if I, why do I keep entering Python 3? So if I try Python 3 app.py, if I do, let's say, this, again it fails. If I were to say some empty space, again it fails, right? So we need some defensive checks to see if to kind of make sure it does not fail. So that's our step two, right? So we'll copy this code and move to step two. So what I'm going to do is, let me just copy this code. I'm going to create a directory in the root folder. I'm going to say step two and just put in a new file. I'm going to say app.py and copy that. We'll close this out. And what we'll do is we'll add some defensive checks. So let's say we have the user input function and we will make this a, we'll remove the spaces just like we did the example here. We added some spaces, right? We added some spaces here and that made a mistake. So I'm going to say dot strip. So that kind of removes these spaces from the left and right. And we'll do it lower, right? Even if the user goes ahead and says types done, we would just we wouldn't want to check both, right? So we'll just say lower. And so if the user input is done, break. Otherwise, right? Now, because this is like obvious, I'll just remove the else. What we'll add is a try check, right? So I'm gonna say try. We'll try and convert it, the amount. So I want to go float equals. No, we'll just say user input and say user input. We'll just try and convert it. And if it fails, so I'm gonna say accept value error. Because this is a number conversion error, it's a value error. And what I'll do is I'm gonna say print. I'm gonna say, let's say invalid input. Cool. And we need to do this and say we need to add it to the amount. So amount equals, let's say amount plus equals user input. Cool. Let's remove the else condition. And what if we do this? Python 3 app.py. We do this. Oopsie. So that fails. Why did that fail? So could not convert string to float, except value error. Okay, so we'll put one more exception there, except we'll just put some generic exception and say print. How about this? I think this is much better. I'm gonna say invalid input. And oh, I was in step two, right? So this should take care of it. So I'm gonna say step two. I'm gonna say Python 3 app.py and there's something it says invalid input, right? So that's functioning. And let's say 232, just for this, and let's say done. Cool. Now, like this works much better than the previous version. Now, this was much better than the step one, right? We have some defensive checks now, but we wrote some try catch inside the main program. How about we convert this to functions, right? So let's do that, right? So that's our step three. So I'm gonna say do this. I'm gonna say mkdir step three. Go inside step three, and we'll create app.py. Let me just move this too. So I'm gonna say cspace step three. Cool. And let me just bring in the previous code. Cool. And I can do this. Cool. Let me just remove that. Now, the idea here is we will convert this into functions. So let's start doing that. So I'm going to say, so I've got this print finance tracker here. How about we move that to kind of, let's say, print header, right? So I'm going to say def print header. I'm going to say print header, right? We're going to say print this. Exactly the same, but we could do some additional stuff. I'm going to say print. I'm going to say, let's just give it some this, right? We will make some modifications to this as we go, but I think this would be much nicer. How about we do equals to sign, right? So this, Cool. And so we have one function we can just call as print header, and that would do that. The part where we do this, where we print the result, right? Let's just move that to a function. Let's say print result, and we will, let's say, take in the amount, and depending on the amount, we would just print this, and we have one function for that too. Let's just move that to the top. Cool. What else? So we have the main part where we accept user input, right? How about we create a main function? So I'm going to say def main. I'm going to say amount equals 0, and we need one function to kind of handle the user input. So I'm going to say def handle user input, and I'm going to pass in the amount and say I'm going to do this. Cool. Let's just say execute, right? That's our main part of the program. Let's just move that out of the way and call execute with the amount, and we will return the amount the moment it breaks. So I'm going to say return amount. Cool. And I will say, we need to say print header. So I'm going to say print header, and we need to call print result with the amount. And if we're to see this, we've got execute, got a while through inside it. It does the exact same logic. How about we just run these? So app Python 3 app.py. We need to call the main function, right? I'm going to call that. I'm going to say main and do Python 3 app.py. So we have a much nicer print header function. We do some random stuff. It says invalid input. We give 199. We'll say minus 99. We say done. It just prints the output, and it's much better than the previous version what we have. Now, if you take a look at this, this was much better than what we had earlier. And what we'll do next as a step 4 is move all these functions into separate modules. And all we will have in our app.py is just the main function, right? So that's called writing code as modules, or separating it as packages, etc., etc. So what we will do is we will create step 4. So I'm going to say mkdir, go back. So let me just do it this way. It's much easier. I'm going to say step 4, and I will say I have an app.py inside step 4, and let's say I have a finance tracker module that keeps all these files. And let's just move to step 4. Cool. Let's copy all our code here. And what do we need inside the finance tracker.py file? Everything except the main.py, right? So we'll copy all of this. Let me just close this. Everything inside, we'll take the main function, take that out. We'll put this here, and we will import. So when you write code as modules, you put in init.py to kind of declare it as a package. So I'm going to say this, and we will import this from, say, dot finance tracker import. Can I say print result? We'll say print header and execute, and that fixes the import errors. And I will say Python 3 app.py. Okay, what's the problem there? What's the problem? Okay, so I do not need the not because both these files are in the same folder. I could just say from finance tracker, and we'll just run these, and it works. I think you can just test that out. 20 minus something, done, and there you go, right? It's functioning. Now, if you looked from the first script that we had, right? Let me just open that. From having this script, we've kind of made it much smaller in terms of readability, and we have improved the way, like someone who looks at this, okay, there's a main function, sets the amount of 0, kind of prints the header, takes in the amount, and prints the result, right? They did not have to kind of look at the other finance tracker. If they want always, they can just take a look at these functions, right? But the idea is, for some, like, this is much more readable than we had in the first one. So the next step, what we are going to do is convert this into a class, right? So we're going to put all the code that's related to the finance tracker part inside a class, right? So I'm going to say that's our step 5. So I'm going to say step 5 and say we'll have two files. I'm going to say app.py just like we had, and a finance tracker class, right? So I'm going to say finance tracker.py, and we have that here inside. Let's just create a class first, right? So I'm going to open this with the step 4 finance tracker part, and we will do that. So we'll write a class. We're going to say class finance tracker, and inside our constructor in it, I'm going to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say self.amount equals 0. And what else do we need? We'll just put the header text. I'm going to say header text equals finance tracker. Cool. We'll just put in a space there and do that. And what else? So let's put in an execute method. So I'm going to say self. We have that. We need to print the result. So I'm going to say def print result. We'll take in self and pass. What else do we have? We have a print header function that does that. Self and print result. Let me just take this, and we'll do that. And instead of amount, I'd say self.amount. Same here. Cool. And what else? So we have this, and we need the execute function. So while true, we'll take all of this, or we'll just call this, we'll just keep the execute free, and I'll do def handle user input and say self, put this inside our function, and anytime you update the amount, you say self.amount. Cool. What else do we need to do? So inside the execute function, this is where I'll call our logic that we had in the step 4 app.py. So I'm going to say print header, right? And let's do this. I'm going to say self dot print header, and I'm going to say self dot execute, and the amount I did not pass, I did not require to pass the amount, and to print the header, I'm going to say self dot print result, right? Again, I did not need to do this. Print result, we've got print header, we've got, let's say, like we do not need to set this, right? We're cool here. So we'll just move that to the top and put that there. And if you were to look, everything that comes related to the finance tracker application is inside the finance tracker part. And how do we execute this? We'll go inside the app.py. We're going to say from finance tracker, import the class, and say if name equals, this is a very common pattern you might have seen, main. We're going to say ft equals will instantiate the class, and for print header we could use this. Instead of doing this, we can say self dot finance, what's the header text, and I'll say ft dot execute, right? So even much better than the previous version what we had. Just go to step 5, and I'll say app.py. Oh, that went into an error. What happened? So if you look at this, let's say ft to execute, so it keeps calling on execute. So why? Okay, there you go. So we renamed our function to handle user input, right? Now we had execute earlier, now we have handle user input. How about we just test that out? So I'm say app.py, and we have, let's say, some amount, and done. There you go, right? That's working. So we need to add one more check here, right? It's 0, 0.0. It's not negative, it's 0. We'll add that. So if we go inside this, so I'm going to say elif self.amount is less than 0. Amount is negative. I will just say else amount is 0, right? Cool. So that will fix that. And what else can we do? So how about we just make this more Pythonic? How about if the end user enters 0 and we do not want to actually set that, right? So how about we just make this look much better than we have? So let's say we've got Python 3 app.py. This just prints in this format, and let's just make it looks much better, right? So what I'm going to do is import the OS module. So I'm going to import OS, and what I'll do is initialize the terminal width. So I'm going to say self dot terminal width equals os dot get terminal size, and I can do columns, so that gives me the width of my terminal. And what I will do is when I print this, I can just do times self dot terminal width, right? And I can just do this. Cool. So that looks much better. And how about I center the finance tracker application? Cool. So I've got the print header function. I've got print header, and I can do this by saying self dot center, and by giving the width, which is our self dot terminal width. And I can do the fill character would be empty string. Cool. So I can do this. And how about we test that out? So I can say Python 3 app.py. So that's entered. So if you look at what we from where we started, we had a very simple script, right? We improved the way we wrote our logic. We kind of put that into functions. We put that into a separate file. We wrote it out as a class, right? All in under just 20 minutes. And we can always make this look much better by centering it, by adding colors with a lot of packages, or maybe using Unicode colors. And essentially, when you write Python programs as a biomedical engineer, it's so much better if you just write it as a class or maybe as functions instead of just rodogging it all as a single file. Thank you so much.